Good evening, everybody. I am back on a Wednesday evening to welcome y'all to another special episode of Mind Word Forum Season 3. We launched this program way back when in 2020 at the onset of the pandemic, and we're proud to keep this programming going into 2022. This year's season of Mind Wars Forum has been made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Tonight, I am really honored and also really excited to sit down and chat with four incredible people who are really change makers in Appalachia. They are leaders. They are women with incredible stories and perspectives. So on the screen, we have Kipp Dawson, Libby Lindsay, Marat Moore, and Dr. Jessie Wilkerson. Let me back up just a second. Libby is on here, but we can't see her face, unfortunately, but her voice will definitely have a presence throughout tonight in this program. We'll be able to dive into their careers in the coal mining industry and their ongoing work in telling and preserving this important piece of not only Appalachian history, but also American history. And so welcome to all four of y'all, and thanks for being here. I will dive on into our first question. During our last episode, we had Hayden Wright from Alabama come on, and she pointed out that, the union's auxiliary work of the Warrior Met strike was not just being done by wives and spouses of mine workers, but there were women miners too. And I was really tickled that she pointed this out. And when people think about coal mining, they often think that, all miners are men. There's this perception out there. But the truth is, there's been thousands of women miners, and there are still many. And so tonight I'm proud to be talking to some of the women who have set the precedent and showed that women could do this work too. And so I wanted to kick off tonight's episode by having each of y'all talk about the paths that led you to become a coal miner and introduce yourselves just a little bit to the audience. And Libby, who is off screen, I want to hand it off to you.
I really wanted to join the union. My dad would come home from work and he'd be talking about at supper table things that went on that day at work, whether the equipment was broke down, what his job was that day, and pranks they pulled on each other and just, safety conditions, whatever. And I was fascinated by all of it and amazed in the relationship that miners have, such a close kinship. I really wanted to be a part of that. And not just that, my dad couldn't read. And I'd read the Mine Workers Journal to him since I was about 11 years old. So I really wanted to join the union. I did. I'd beg to go to union meeting with me, and he'd tell me girls couldn't go to union meeting. And so that's it. I hadn't made any plans beyond high school to do what I was going to do. Maybe I thought I'd meet Prince Charming and just live happily ever after. But since he didn't materialize at the time, I went and applied for jobs in the mines. When I applied at Bethlehem, they said, because we have contracts with the federal government, we'll have to start hiring some women after the first of the year. You can go ahead and apply now, and we'll call you when we have to. And they did, when they had to.
Libby, can you say what year that was?
1976. Well, it was 75 when I applied. I hired in February of 1976.
And where was this? Was this in West Virginia?
Yes, ma'am, at the Bethlehem mine at Van, or in Boone County in southern West Virginia.
Cool. So not too far from Mingo County at all.
Nope.
Kipp, how did you end up as a miner? What led you to that path?
Well, actually, my story's not that different from Libby's, even though I grew up very far away from coal mines. I grew up in my mother's union hall with her. My mom was a Rosie the Riveter during World War II, and she stayed in the factories after the war. And she was very active in her union. And we grew up with the picture of John L. Lewis on our wall in the projects where I grew up, because my mom had been inspired as a child by the general strike in San Francisco. In 1934, she was 10 years old, and she believed that if there was going to be any change in this country for people like us, unions were going to have to lead it. And the union that she looked to the most, and this was true for a lot of people back then, was the United Mine Workers, because the UMW made the CIO happen. And the CIO was where my mother's union was based. My mother was in the ILWU, the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, it was called then. It's now International Longshore and Warehouse Workers Union. And she was in the warehouse section of that. And truly, I grew up, my mother was extraordinarily active in her union. She was a feminist before her time. She and her co-workers fought for equal pay for women. And she also was in a union situation, in the housing situation I was in, that was where Black women who had come to the North during the Great Migration in order to get jobs during World War II were among the leaders of both where we lived and in her union. And my mom was right in there with them. So it took me, I had some interesting things in my life between growing up in my mom's house and when I got the opportunity to apply for jobs in Pittsburgh. I was looking to get hired in 1978 in either a steel mill or a coal mine, because I was anxious to be a part of the things that were going on in the unions then too. Both the Steelworkers Union and the Mine Workers Union had been through big changes that opened the door to making them combative unions willing to actually go to bat for the members. And the Miners for Democracy in the UMW was a big deal. And because Black steelworkers had gone to court and made it necessary for the steel industry to start hiring and promoting not only Black workers but women, there were legal things that opened the doors to women getting into these industries. And also, thanks to the work of Betty Jean Hall and the Coal Employment Project, jobs were opening up for women in coal mines. And I got hired by the same company that hired Libby 3 years later, only in Pennsylvania. I got hired into a Bethlehem mine in Pennsylvania, and ended up being in probably the best possible place, because I got hired into a United Mine Workers local that was used to taking on problems and fighting for the members, because the leaders were members of the Miners for Democracy who had really transformed the union.
That's incredible. We're going to get into the Coal Employment Project, I know, a little bit later on in the show, so I'm glad you mentioned that. Marat, could you talk a little bit about your career? Oh, let me take you off mute.
Okay. I had quite a different route. I grew up in Johnson City, Tennessee, and was working as a cub reporter for the Johnson City paper in 1976 when the Scotia mine blew up, 90 miles away as the crow flies in Harlan County in Oven Fort, Kentucky. So nobody wanted to go. So I volunteered to go. And they sent me up there with a couple of carrier pigeons. That was their attitude. A couple of carrier pigeons that were supposed to fly the film back to Johnson City. Okay. So being there and seeing what was going on, I understood. I saw that the reporters were being told more than the families were being told. So I went to the families and told them what they were telling me. And so it went on late, and so went back over Black Mountain toward Johnson City. And then the next morning before dawn, there's a big knocking on my door. The mine blew up again, and there were federal mine inspectors. And so that experience woke me up, and it just kind of changed the trajectory of my next 20 years. Unlike Kipp and unlike Libby, I would say that my mother in particular did not understand any of this. So I went to Mingo County, worked as a Vista on flood recovery. This was after the Great Appalachian Flood of 1977. And in the process met Linda Thompson, who was a woman miner. And she and her husband and her dog Tramper were living in a car. And so I just got very close to Linda over the years. But Linda snuck me in her mine at midnight shift. I mean, that wouldn't happen now, right? But she snuck me in. And when I got down there, I was like, I want to know about this. I want to be the way people are being together down here. So, went through the training, and I got hired at U.S. Steel number 20 at Thacker. It was a weak local union, very corrupt, a lot of accidents. And as I was telling Kenzie before the show, I worked there for a little more than a year. And then my father had died in the late 70s. And my mother was sort of struggling, and I felt like I really needed to go back and be with her. So I left, but I missed the mine so much that I thought, I'm just going to start trying to do oral histories with women miners, because those stories need to be told. We had 14 women when I first went in, right? And so I was able to talk myself underground with a camera. I was photographing my equipment sounds so antique. It was like a cassette recorder and a Nicormat loaded with Tri-X film. I mean, that's what I had in general. But anyway, I'd talk myself underground and be able to take pictures of women. And this was before, it wasn't before CEP, but a lot of the women were not part of CEP. So anyway, then I got hired by the UMWA in 1983. And the only thing I would say is that the women in late 1983, the layoffs started, right? We had Reagan in the White House. So Rich Trumka had just been elected. So I go up there, and the women, 3 women are called back at our mine. And that's Linda Thompson, who had been working on the tipple. They put her underground because she had seniority to stay. Then a woman named Linda Staten and Betty Jo Snodgrass. That's December 1983, they're called back. In February of 1983, Linda Staten's working a roof bolter. And she had a piece of top that was the size of bigger than a car hood that was pulled down on her. And she almost died, and she ended up with a big steel plate put in her head, okay? And then in April, Linda Thompson and I were still talking to each other, like long conversations on the phone. So on Easter of 1984, we had an hour-long conversation about her struggles. Her husband had died in December, and she was underground suddenly and everything. 2 days later, a friend of mine from Mingo County called me and said, you need to sit down, and told me that Linda had been killed in a buggy accident. So I remember fleeing to the basement. We worked in the basement, the UMW Journal, fleeing to the basement and calling my friend Cosby Totten, and Joe Main in the safety department deputized me to be able, as a safety person, to be able to go to the mine, go pick up her dog tag, go down and see where it happened and all that stuff. So, that's, and then Betty Jo called me in DC and said, I'm really worried. She was feeling really vulnerable. She said, I'm really worried. She said, the men are telling me there's a run of bad luck and that I'm next, So later on, I will just say Linda Staten showed up at a CEP conference, which she normally didn't go, but she showed up to a Charleston conference later on. And she said to me, she goes, you want to go for a jog? I'm like, so anyway, so I spent most of my years working on the book off and on, and working 11 years or so at the United Mine Workers, doing a bunch of different stuff.
Thanks, Marat. And Kipp is holding up Marat's work.
Yeah.
Women in
Let me tell you the story. I'm gonna focus too on the picture. Okay, this is a woman in Mingo County. This is Nancy Bowen. She lived in South Williamson. This is her son Randy. She had a second son. Nancy Bowen worked low coal until 3 days, 4 days before she had her baby. They had trained the crew in emergency childbirth techniques. And then she had the fastest delivery that had ever been seen in Williamson Hospital. But the Mingo County, women were dying in Mingo County. Her sister-in-law, Ellie Bowen, married to her brother Donnie. They worked at Raw Sales, Massey and Don Blankenship. Anyway, but years ago, she was the first woman in West Virginia to be killed. And I'm not sure, that might have been 81, something like that. But I remember going to the funeral. So there was a lot of issues around Mingo.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Marat and Kipp and Libby, for sharing those stories and the stories of the women that you worked with and knew. I want to turn to Jessie, because Jessie, you are not a miner. And so could you talk a little bit about how you got roped into this group? How do you know these ladies?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm just honored to be here. So thank you, Kenzie, for putting this together. And anytime I get to be in a space with Kipp and Marat and Libby, it's just really powerful and delightful, and they're incredible women. So I'm really grateful. So, I mean, I'm not a miner. I've never been in a mine. But I got really interested in the Coal Employment Project years ago. And I went to the archives at East Tennessee State University. I'm from East Tennessee. And I spent time in those archives and was really interested in the history, and thought back then that I would do, like a decade ago, that I would work on a project. And then I didn't. I went in a different direction. But, these things kind of loop back around. So when I got to West Virginia University, where I work now, a group of women were collaborating on a project to preserve and document the history of feminist activism, broadly defined in West Virginia. And they reached out to me because they knew that I focused on the histories of working class women and labor feminists. And they invited me to join that project with the West Virginia and Regional History Center. So that was happening. And then the second thing that happened was that I learned about Kipp Dawson. And I knew that she was asking around about historians or other scholars who might be interested in helping tell this really rich history, as you've already heard, this really incredible and rich and necessary history of women miners, and help them document and preserve their stories. So that's kind of where I come in. Those things were happening, and I just, right place, right time, learned about these things. And at this point, we're working on an oral history project. Kipp, Marat, and Libby have been really crucial to organizing that. And we have a wonderful group of graduate students here at WVU who are starting, over the last few weeks, starting to record interviews. And those will be housed here at WVU. They'll be made available to the public. And then we're also hoping to collect ephemera, documents, scrapbooks, other materials, things that help us tell this history. So if anyone out there is listening and you're interested in this work and you've wondered if your stuff is should be preserved in an archive, I would say yes, it's probably really important, and you should please reach out to me, or of course Kipp or Marat and Libby. Libby can also help you make those decisions about preserving this history. And just typically institutions like WVU, other big universities, they have these archives. For a long time, they focused on the history of like the owning class and the capitalists, right? And they didn't really tell the story of working class people in depth. And so we're really trying to change that, both with the West Virginia Feminist Activism collection, but also this collection on women miners' history.
That is such an awesome project.
Kenzie, could I just add a little bit to what Jessie just said? Because Jessie has been an absolutely marvelous encourager of the things that we were trying to do before we ever met her. But she's also making things happen that otherwise wouldn't happen. But why in the world would some of us who are in our 60s and 70s be concerned right now about doing the kinds of things that Jessie just described? And here's my answer. For one thing, Marat and I have been collecting things for history since we first met in the Coal Employment Project, because we're both amateur historians and we think they're important. So we have lots of stuff that tell lots of stories. But the thing that I really was driven to want to do was, there's a phrase right now among people historians to de-anonymize history, to make it not to put real people into the stories that are the real history of real working class people that Jessie is talking about collecting. And all of us who've worked in the mines, all of the women who worked in the mines for sure, have met absolutely astounding human beings with incredible stories that they have done, who we were drawn to wanting to make sure did not get lost when they died. And we have lost a lot of our sisters. I mean, we're getting older. And probably half of the women I worked with in the Pennsylvania mines are no longer alive. So we've been feeling the pressure of wanting to make this happen. But there's another thing that was brought home to me, and I have to give some credit right now to the women in the building trades who have been meeting over the years also with similar drive to what we have. And Jessie has helped to bring us together. And so some of us, Marat and Libby and I, have been meeting, and Betty Jean Hall, have been meeting with the women in the building trades. And what they told me yesterday really made sense when I was at a meeting with a couple of them. It's not just because we think there's great stories that need to be in history books somewhere. It's because there are young women right now who don't know that they have the potential to do the kinds of things that you guys have done, that we have done, that we were able to do, that we were blessed with the opportunity to be able to do. They need to be inspired and also given some backing when they go out there and try and buck things. If this world is going to continue to exist, there's going to be big transitions in how energy is produced in this country, which means lots of new jobs, which mean lots of apprenticeships, which mean that either those jobs are going to become union jobs that women can get, or we're going to go back to the days when it's going to be job trusts and the unions are not there. And we have a responsibility, I think, because we have access to these stories and our own experiences, to help pass them on, not just so that people can read nice stories, but because there's going to be more struggles too. So I really want to tip my hat to the women in the building trades who didn't have the advantages we had. As coal miners, we got to work in the same place every day with the same guys, and we got to be members of the same union around the country. These women did amazing things, and they are also trying to open doors to women now.
Yep, thank you so much for adding that and putting it much better than I would have. I couldn't agree more. You talk about working with the same men every day. I wonder, this could be for you or for Marat or Libby as well. How did men treat y'all in the mines?
Libby, you take that, okay? You have the most.
I've never met a woman miner who didn't say that the old timers treated us very well, better than the younger men. And that was certainly the case with me. Not that I had much of any issues. For one thing, I hired in with people I had just graduated high school with, so I've known them all my life. Even the older people who were already there, a lot of those had graduated with my sisters, and it's small town America. Everybody knew everybody. They knew my family. They knew my mom and they knew my dad, but the old timers took me under their wing. They showed me the safest and easiest way to do a job and just really were mentors and protectors and treated me very well.
Thank you, Libby.
I had similar experiences. I had a guardian angel named Hank Clancy, who as a child had been shot at by the coal and iron police when there were strikes going on in the mining areas, when he and his friends were trying to get scraps of coal to heat their homes. And this guy, Hank, was the union man through and through, and he was respected by everybody in the mine, he and his generation. And when they saw that we were serious about being union people, there was nothing that he wouldn't do to make people treat us with respect and to help us learn how to do stuff. And that caught on. But I have to say that in my mind, in particular, the guys who were the most helpful were the black miners, almost every one of them. It didn't hurt that two of them had wives and sisters in the mines and were supportive in that kind of way. But the company tried to get rid of me early on by putting me on a work crew that was me and only black men, assuming that they would run this little white woman out of the mine. It was an incredible, beautiful shift. I've done some writing about it. And I think maybe watching us tonight at his house, Wendell Tyler, the son of one of the men who was on that crew, his mom also worked in our mine. Those men saw in the women people with whom they could build solidarity, and it was really something. Now, I have to say, and I'm sure it needs to be said, that Libby and I had better situations than a lot of women did. There were times when women were hired into mines where the men did not have the same kinds of push to welcome women, and women had to put up with quite a bit. And some of the stories of harassment and that sort of thing needed to be told. And here's where the Coal Employment Project really came in. The Coal Employment Project / Coal Mining Women Support Team. I don't know if you can see, this is the name of our group. I don't know if it shows on this shirt. Not very well. Betty Jean Hall, who is an attorney who was driven to want to support women getting into the mines, founded the Coal Employment Project in 1977. But from 1979 through the 90s, we had annual conferences where women miners could get together and talk about these things and help each other through them. And every month there was a newsletter that was put out where our stories were told and the things that we were coming up against could be told. And we had, from the very beginning of my time in the mines, Libby's already been in for a while when this started, we had the kind of solidarity and support that made it possible for women who weren't as well received as Libby and I were in our mines to be able to get support from women who were. And we also had a force inside the union to get the union to take responsibility for helping to make the workplace a safe place. And that meant welcoming all the people who were working as brothers and sisters underground.
I can jump in there too and say a little bit more about the Coal Employment Project. So, I think, Kipp has really captured the spirit of the Coal Employment Project, and Betty Jean Hall, who the lawyer was a lawyer. And I think with the one thing about the Coal Employment Project historically that's so interesting is the way it intersects with policymaking and other movements that were underway. So, for instance, I was looking back at an article that Betty Jean Hall wrote about the founding of CEP, and she wrote about going to New York and getting a Ms. Foundation grant, right? So Ms. Magazine, the feminist publication, I think it was something like $5,000. And then she used that to help get the organization going and searched for women who were interested in getting jobs in the mines. At the time, 99.8% of all people in the industry, that included miners, but also all staff, 99.8% were men. And there was an assumption that women didn't want jobs in the mines, or that they were bad luck in the mines, that they couldn't do those jobs. And then, of course, the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination based on race and sex. So Betty Jean was acting on that legislation and helping to implement it in the 70s when she, helped women with lawsuits to get jobs in the mines. And so it was a legal strategy at first, but then also, as Kipp said, it was about building solidarity and building a support group for women who, were doing this job. And I know for me, when I, the decade or whatever ago that I was in the archives of the Coal Employment Project records, what so captivated me were the newsletters. And Marat or Kipp, I don't know if you have any of those handy, but there are these amazing newsletters where women shared the news of what was happening in the mines, in the Coal Employment Project. They shared advice like finding boots that fit properly, or other clothing that would fit them, or how to address sexual harassment in the workplace when it happened. And they were just really inspiring documents that I think that are archived and may be made. I think there's some that are digital at this point. So that's, to me, the Coal Employment Project is really this example of people building on the women's movement and civil rights movement and the policy making to make change in the workplace.
I would like to add that Betty Jean got into this because she worked at the East Tennessee Research Council, and they scheduled a tour underground. But she wasn't on the tour, but the woman who was on the tour, they said everybody else can go in but her. And that's when Betty Jean started talking to people and saying, you know what? If they're not letting a woman lawyer in this office go down, I doubt they're letting anybody else go down. And so when she began to take cases to really crack open the portals of mines all over the country for women, what she did is she took that money and seeded an endowment to create a national organization. She went to every coal state. She built a small staff. I worked there for a little bit, but she was all over the country. And people would just come out and they would, we went so far beyond Central Appalachia. We were all over the country. We were in Navajo land. We were international. It was the most immersive, amazing solidarity, warmth, family, support I have ever seen. And that's the seed that I hope we plant also with young women, that this is, it can happen. And it made a huge difference. It was freeing. Women miners were much freer than a lot of their male coworkers in terms of being able to travel, being able to build solidarity. I was at the UMW International. I was working at the UMW Journal, and luckily the male coal miner on staff didn't want to go underground. So I got to go underground all over the country to, and would see women miners and sort of see the cultural differences and the differences in the mines. I mean, for example, in Nova Scotia, we have members. We didn't have any women that I knew of in Nova Scotia, but they had undersea mines in Nova Scotia. So what Betty Jean did was she created something that grew and grew and began to grow on the energy of the women who were there. And I, like Kipp, I'm so impressed with the tradeswomen's group. I mean, it's history, it's activism, it's important to preserve, because when we were involved for all those years in our own way, right, Kipp and Libby, it was like you didn't know that the door was going to close, right?
Right.
On the industry. You didn't know it because we were all in every possible way, in different ways. And all of a sudden, some of that door started to close. And so then CEP folded in the late 90s, and people really missed each other. And then because we brought this archive to East Tennessee State University, I'd worked with Cosby Totten, who was a CEP leader who was involved in so many ways, God rest her soul, to get the archive to East Tennessee State University, near where I grew up, because they were so interested. So, there are many different facets of the Coal Employment Project, but it was way beyond the sum of the parts, I think.
Libby, do you have anything you want to add here?
As much as I wanted to join the union and found that kinship that I was looking for, the Coal Employment Project was beyond that. They are, not was, not were, are my family now.
So if people want to learn more about the Coal Employment Project, would they go to the archives in East Tennessee? Are there other resources that you'd point them to?
We are certainly building other resources, but they could start with the Archives of Appalachia at East Tennessee State University. It's part of the library system. Much of it is digitized. I know there's a lot of different collections that intersect there. There's the CEP archives. There is a lot of tapes. All my tapes are there. And June Roston ran the Southern Empowerment Project, was involved with CEP. Her information, all that stuff is there. It's a place to begin. And I know, Kipp, you're working with Pitt now, right?
Okay, there. Sorry. Yes, but I also want to say this, that if there are any women miners, of people who worked in the mines, who are interested in staying in touch with us on a daily basis, we have a Facebook group that you would be more than welcome to join. It's called Women Miners Reunion. And you can contact any one of us who are on here, and we can help you get information. Yes, ETSU definitely is the home of our archives, but what the West Virginia Regional Archive Center that WVU hosts, it's also building tremendous archives, and so is the University of Pittsburgh. So I think the way that the archivists work these days to collaborate with one another across the walls that don't bind them, don't separate them so much, that if you were to contact any of those archives or any of us, and if you're interested in finding out more information about anything in particular or the CEP in general, we would be very happy to help guide you through the things that we know about. And if you have stories to add, we're looking for those. We are looking for those. I just want to say one other thing about, if I might, about what we're building on. Jessie Wilkerson tells us that she began her research work at the Eastern Tennessee State University around women miners. But I think what happened with Jessie is a really beautiful example of why it's so important that we're telling these stories, because Jessie went on from there to discover, as she says in her book, which really, you got to read this book. I don't like to glare on this, but it's if you live here, to live here, you've got to fight. You have to fight. Jessie talks about things that we learned to name by reading her book. Libby and Marat and I have talked about this, and Betty Jean, the culture of care that women bring into the world, around which we organized as coal miners, is something that we didn't know how to name, but we do now have a name for it. And it's one of the reasons why this is also important, is because what women miners found ourselves doing very naturally in the Coal Employment Project was building on that culture that Jessie told us existed way before we started working in coal mines. The culture of care that women, thank goodness, helped to keep alive in the human race. And we're just a piece of that.
Yeah, Jessie, do you want to talk about the book, your book and its origins?
Sure. So the book is about the coal fields of Eastern Kentucky and women's activism there and organizing there, in starting during the War on Poverty and afterwards. And as Kipp said, what I was really interested in was women's labor that they do, as wage work, but also the unwaged work that women typically take on because of how our society is structured, because of the laws, because of our culture. And so there were just amazing women in Eastern Kentucky whose life stories were really compelling. So I tried to tell the story of anti-poverty organizing and the many movements that related to it around community health care and environmental justice and labor organizing, and how the thread that connected many of those things was around the ethic of caring, or the ethic of care labor, and what that means when people live in the coal fields. And I think because we live through COVID now, we all get this. We all understand that we need to take care of one another, and that, the frontline workers were those people who provided the things that we need for daily life. That was the most important labor. And so I was tracking that kind of labor historically. And that's something that I also saw I write about it a little bit in the book, among the women miners in the Coal Employment Project, is they were fighting for family leave policies and pushing the UMW to take up family leave policies really early. They were the vanguard of that movement, and then helped to push for legislation. So what we now know is the Family and Medical Leave Act, which certainly isn't enough. We want more than what FMLA provides, but women miners were pushing for more back in the 80s. And we wouldn't have that legislation without their organizing and the organizing of lots of other working class women.
So we want to put a name on that, right, Marat? There's the two women who led us in this were Cosby Totten, who was one of the central leaders of the Coal Employment Project, and Carol Davis, Pennsylvania miner, Black woman who became pregnant while she was working in the mines, and out of necessity had to take on the fight that she and Cosby then made into a central thing that the Coal Employment Project did, and make it happen the way that Jessie just said. Brought United Mine Workers the need to fight for family medical leave. That helped make it happen in Congress. But I just want to say one other thing about Carol Davis. Carol's mine caught on. Carol worked in the mine next door to mine. Mariana Mine, also owned by Bethlehem Steel. Bethlehem had a lot of women miners, and we were not quiet people. But Carol was one of the first women to get a job in the coal mines in Pennsylvania. And when her mine caught on fire in the late 80s, she and all the other miners lost their jobs. So Carol, who was a mother of a bunch of kids and a hardworking woman, went out and got a job where she could, which was in home health care. Home health care workers were not represented by a union. So what did Carol do? She took all the training. She was a leader of her union local when she was a coal miner. She took that into home health care, and she helped to organize what is now a very strong union of home health care workers. And that was just the natural thing, that the culture of care, plus having the experience as a coal miner and the experience in the United Mine Workers and the experience in the Coal Employment Project, it was a natural thing for Carol to do. And she is now nationally recognized as a leader in the home health care organizing. It just comes right out of Jessie's book.
Mm-hmm. If I could, I'd like to also go into that culture of care and how it works in strikes, as it's happening with Hayden and the Warrior Met strike, and how it happened. When I think of what's going on in Brookwood, it reminds me actually of what happened in Brookside. Like from Brookside in 1973 to Brookwood, there's a similarity there. That was the subject of Harlan County, USA. But when I was at the UMWA, part of what I was involved with were the two big strikes, the Massey strike in Mingo, and I had some background in Mingo, and really talked to the head organizer about the importance of organizing women, the miners' wives, and getting in touch with them. And he was like totally against it, but we just sort of did it anyway. Didn't get that far at Massey. Massey was a tough strike. It was Rich Trumka's first strike. It was a bitter defeat, in part because Don Blankenship, who was, well known now, but at that time he was just the local front man for raw sales and processing. He basically was very shrewd. And anyway, that was a very tough strike. But then it turned around in another 2 years with the Pittston strike. So there was a change, in the union's approach, and that was to do civil disobedience training for staff and to approach the entire thing through civil disobedience. And at that time, I remember that head organizer had gone off to run the Teamsters campaign. So I thought, maybe there's more receptivity because of what happened at Massey. And there was, as far as the ability to organize women and communities. And so I brought on Cosby Totten, CEP leader on lost time wages, and a local woman, Catherine Tompa, who hadn't been in CEP, but was local woman laid off. So we started going around with a dozen auxiliaries, meeting with them, listening to them, answering their questions, finding out what it was, kind of where they were coming from, what kinds of things would work for them. And so we worked for a full year. In fact, the union, the locals down there worked for a year to get ready for that strike, didn't leap into it. It was over the loss of health care benefits for 1,500 miners. So as far as the women miners involvement, there was a lot of support, but we had 3 women miners organizing with the auxiliaries. And so what happened was that it took off. They did community parades. The communities were all receptive. This was throughout Southwest Virginia. There were really about 1,000 women as part of all this at one time or another. They also, the union established Camp Solidarity. So there was a whole other group of women who were feeding up to 2,000 visitors a day at Pittston. Pittston was an amazing thing, but we had an occupation, okay? And what happened was, with the civil disobedience, there was discussion around the UMWA war room, as they called it, down in Southwest Virginia. And I was around, and they were like, well, we got to, and, they were ready to start civil disobedience. And so the women were the first active civil disobedience. These are the daughters of Mother Jones inside the Pittston office. Cosby is here in the back. I'm in the middle. They have 40 women, and they showed up. So we call this thing, and we met like at 6 a.m. to organize it. People showed up that we didn't know. Women we didn't know, and we weren't sure. There were 2 who were pregnant, right? We were going to go into the main office and occupied until we got arrested. And so what happened was women said, look, I can't give my name. If there's any coverage, it's going to be reprisal on my husband. So what we did, we said, okay, let's number off. And then they said, well, what are we going to call ourselves? And Cosby goes, well, how about the daughters of Mother Jones? And so that's how it happened. So we each took a number, and it was brilliant in the end. And this is why, unexpectedly brilliant. We get in there, and so everybody, as you can see, we had camo. You can't really tell in this picture, but we had camo, sort of turkey veil, white shirts, excuse me, I've got mine. This is my original old flag. We had our flags. We had all these songs we were singing. We were dancing. Anyway, they locked us in, and so what we were the daughter of Mother Jones, number 1 through 40. Okay, I was number 35. Edna Sauls was a spokesman. She was number 14. So what happened was, it was really cool, is that CNN shows up. Okay, CNN comes in, and CNN's rolling the cameras going, what are you all doing? And Edna Sauls, who are you? And Edna Sauls gets on camera, and she goes, well, I'm the daughter of Mother Jones, number 14. And the reporter says, shut the camera off. And he goes, who is Mother Jones? So we had a history bites. We were like, oh, well, let us tell you about Mother Jones. And so anyway, it was brilliant. And the other thing that happened is there was a guy named Gail Gentry, who is an injured miner who was in a wheelchair. It's a big hill up to the building, right? So there was a side door they let, and he brought love notes to all the numbers from their husbands, like number 15, number 22, number this. So he brought the love notes. He brought the food in his wheelchair, and it was amazing. And so we were there overnight. The guy locked us in. They had to shut down production while we were inside, and for all the pits and mines, we wanted to stay there. Okay, but there was a big crowd gathered. All the husbands, all the families, the major strike organizer for this strike, down at the bottom of the hill. And what I learned, because I was staff, and so the main organizer was talking, kind of sending me notes, is that they were getting irritated with all this support, and they really needed to go do the real stuff, right? And so he told me that I had to tell everybody that we had to leave. And none of us wanted to leave. We wanted to be arrested. So, but we did, right? Everybody said, well, we got to do it. So everybody walked out singing, and we were there for 36 hours, I guess. But anyway, it went on to, there was a lot of creative stuff, because the company didn't, they didn't take miners' wives seriously. And so what women were doing, what the auxiliaries were doing is, they do things like, there'd be all these state troopers everywhere, right? All these guards. And they were snaking around all these, the little rural number signs for the roads. Well, the daughters of Mother Jones would go around and change them. We'd change all the signs. And so they'd get lost. And there was a lot of that. So, but it was, we picketed at jails because a lot of people were jailed then. Mass civil disobedience at Moss 3 prep plant. And I'm just looking for some of my stuff. But anyway, it was, there was just many roles, and women could do, there were so many things to do. The problem was that one time I went back to DC, all right? And I knew that because somebody told me, it was like they didn't want the women, including me, to know it. But the men were planning to occupy Moss 3 prep plant. And so, but they wanted the women all out to support. But they didn't tell me that, or Cosby that, or Catherine that, none of us. So I go back to DC, and I'm called at 4 a.m. and told, you have to come down here right now. And I'm like, I know what I'm going to, but not because any of them have told me, but because somebody else told me. So I went down there, and they said, you've got to call out all the women, and you all, all of them. And they have to be here indefinitely. And they have to supply all the food and everything. And I looked at them and I said, don't you realize that they have kids and they have to work that stuff out? And so it was an interesting thing. I mean, it all happened, but I'm saying that it's part of the problem was the International was calling the shots, and that was difficult, overall. That did not happen at Brookside. They were independently organized because they were trying to get the union, and I think Hayden has just done, and those folks down there have done an awesome job, of the kind of network that they've set up to just take care of everyone. But the daughters certainly did a lot of innovative things and were arrested and hauled off. Yeah.
And one thing is that the same thing happened in England during the miners' strike in 1984-85. Miners' wives took the same kinds of actions that Mara just described in Britain. And guess who recognized that was going on? The Coal Employment Project and women miners. And so we were able to go to England and bring solidarity back and forth between our striking British sisters supporting the men in that big strike there. That's a plate that was given to Mara. We have from our British sisters in solidarity, and to bring some of them back to the United States to help support us in our strikes, because back then Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were on the same kick. Break the unions in England, break them in the United States. And where do you start? With the strongest union in both countries, the United Mine Workers here and the British Miners Union there. And the solidarity that we women miners were able to bring back and forth between the miners' wives, it continues today. A little story, thanks to those relationships, people in Great Britain right now who were involved in the miners' strike in 84-85 there just raised a bunch of money to support the women's auxiliary that Hayden leads. And that connection is still alive. And there we get back to Jessie's culture of care. It's the women find it easy to make those connections.
Yeah, the past is very much present. We are getting close to 1 hour. I feel like we could sit and talk all night, and I see folks in the comments saying this is awesome. We're having so much fun. I want to ask one last question and give everyone a chance to answer. And the question is, what are some of the ways the history of women miners is important in the landscape of American history and also world history? Jessie, I'll let you kick us off.
Okay. It's a great question. And I think if anyone doubted the importance of the history, they just got a lesson in why it's important from listening to this conversation. So I don't know how much more I can really add, except to say that as a historian, the history of women's labor, and including women miners, but as Kipp has said about Carol Davis, and I know as for Kipp herself, women did other work. They weren't just in the mines, and that's a history we're trying to capture as well. So, but women's labor history to me is so important because women straddle these two kinds of labor very frequently. So the labor of that's often unwaged or is low wage, that's about taking care of children and elderly folks and our communities, taking care of one another during these strikes, taking care of family members. And then you have this history of women who entered traditionally male workplaces. And it's not like they adopted masculine culture when they entered those spaces. They brought that perspective with them. And so being able to trace that history of what happens to care labor as women are making those transitions into the workplace, but also what happens to those workplaces as women enter them. They must change, right? That necessarily they have to change. And so that's something that to me is really a really important part of labor history and American history. And then, of course, this history is also about labor movements. So I'm the granddaughter of a union organizer for the Amalgamated Clothing Workers and then the Act Two Clothing and Textile Workers Union. And I got into this history in part because I really care about working class and labor history. And as we've heard tonight, we can learn a lot about the history of the labor movement and how people have organized within unions, but also crucially how they've organized outside of unions. So like Coal Employment Project was a working women's organization that is not a traditional labor union. It had many important ties to the UMWA, but there have been many cases in American history where workers who were marginalized because we live in a sexist, racist, heterosexist, transphobic society, workers have had to organize in other ways. And the Coal Employment Project shows us that also the transnational organizing was really important then. That continues to be a really important lesson today. So I'll stop there. I could keep going, but I hope people are convinced it's really important.
It is. Thank you, Jessie. I want to pass the question over to Libby, who is unfortunately not on our screen, but she is with us tonight. Libby, do you have anything you want to add?
A favorite story of mine about Mother Jones, one of the many times that she addressed the UMW conventions, she had brought a young man with her, and she indicated and said that he had come to her and told her that after several months on strike, that they weren't making any progress and they were starved out essentially and were going to have to end the strike and go back to work with nothing won. She said, Mother Jones said, call the women together. I want to meet with them. Their wives, mothers, daughters, wives, the saying is, came together, and she told them why this was not just the men's issue, why this was everyone's issue, why this strike mattered to the women and why it was their strike as well, and that they were going to end the strike. The women said, oh, no, this ain't happening. And they set up their mop and broom, I'll get my tongue around it in a minute, mop and broom brigades, among other activities, carried the strike on for another month or two and won their strike. Mother Jones told the convention, women are fighters. They were then, and we are now. Women opened doors for me. A wise woman in my life told me, you don't kick down walls, you pull the nails out and let them fall. Women pulled nails out and walls fell down that I was able to just walk right on in. And I'm trying to pull those nails out for the young women coming behind me.
Thank you so much, Libby. Marat?
Well, I just would like to say how important a deep dive in history is to understand where we are. So, for example, when I was working on my book, I was trying to find women who had worked as undocumented workers. What was the history? Well, Kim Kelly in the last forum talked about Ida Mae Stahl. So I wasn't able to interview her because it was 1980 and I was still in Mingo County. But I did interview, I wrote letters to every coalfield migration town where families had moved in the 50s and 60s and got back these letters in spidery handwriting and went to see them. They were about in 5 states. But this is Ida Mae's sister, Elizabeth Stahl Crawford. Whoops. And she worked much longer than Ida Mae ever did. She went in at 1920 at the age of about 15 and worked off and on for 30 years. But in the research for my book, I found that I spent my Saturdays while I was working at the UMWA at the Library of Congress. And I found that there are records for women coal miners in the 13th century. That's 1,000 years ago. Records. There are woodcuts of women miners in 1558. There is a huge history of what happened was in Japan, there were 38,000 women coal miners. They set up nurseries and this was in the early 1920s, from 1900 into the 1920s. Here comes a train. And anyway, then what happened was as the Depression came on, this also occurred in India. There were 40,000 plus in India at the same time. So what happened was when the Depression came on, there were all these prohibitions, bans against women in the mines. And so they started shutting it down everywhere. And that is when reminds me of Jim Crow, frankly. It's when all the taboos about bad luck occurred. It occurred after the bans on women's employment, where women were no longer identified with their ability to work. These were obviously in pre-industrial mining situations, but they were underground. And there are great stories of women in Belgium in I think it's the 17th century, where they fought back. They were just, they were attacked and they just fought back. They organized. There are some amazing stories there. So I'm saying that, it's learning about labor history and, labor history like the Ludlow massacre in Colorado. So I was out there doing stories on the pensioners, and this woman tapped me on the shoulder and she said, "Honey, we fought for the union at Ludlow." And I looked at her, and this was in the 1980s. There was nobody alive at Ludlow, right? That I knew. She was 7 years old. So hers is one of the first stories in this book. And she had graphic descriptions of Mother Jones being out there, but everything that occurred with all of the assault. And she told me, people don't know, but the women were raped. So when those folks came in, they were raping people too, but nobody ever talked about that. So I do think that, my effort has been to witness and be with people. 70 interviews I transcribed by myself, and I found that in listening to them, having to transcribe them by myself for financial reasons, I had to do that. But it was amazing because I could flash back to every interview. There were times when there were 3 women together, Brenda Brock, and her 2 buddies all night long. We smoked cigarettes. We had the cassette running for 12 hours. They talked. They'd never talked about being underground before. So I do think that all of it works together. The history works together. The networks works together. The activism that Libby and Kipp have been involved in within their very strong local unions. The work I try to do with the UMWA, and just share a couple more pictures. These are CP women. This is Shirley Heitch, who we all know and love. This was early on. This was I took it by available light. And then our friend who marched with, I couldn't because of COVID, but Kipp and Libby marched Blair Mountain. And here is Doris McGann when she was working in local West Virginia, who also marched. So my job, I felt always, was to be a documentarian. I'm not a trained historian, but I'm a documentarian. I tried to document everything I could as best as I could, and just appreciate Kipp reaching out, Jessie for what you're doing, Kenzie for what you all are doing, Libby for her amazing life. So thank you.
Thank you, Kipp.
Well, and you can see women miners like to talk, and we have a lot of stories to tell, and we'll be available to continue doing that. And anybody wants to talk with us. But to answer your question, here's where I'm at right now. If there is going to be a planet Earth, the kind of thing that the culture of care that Jessie talks about is going to have to become predominant in the culture of the world. And if we want to look for inspiration in times when war and the destruction of our planet are so much all around us, where can we look? We can look to places where women are taking leads and have in the past. Not only women are going to be doing this, but when women are involved in things, they bring something that is absolutely necessary in today's world into the forefront of the work. As Marat referred to the fact that Libby and I marched in the commemoration of the centennial of the Battle of Blair Mountain together in West Virginia last year, we were able to walk over sacred ground, and we could feel the presence of the women and the men who had been there 100 years ago trying to keep something going, of the spirit of solidarity that crossed racial lines and gender lines and language lines and brought working class people together to struggle for each other. That's the kind of thing that women can play and have played a special role in, and that part of history needs to be told. It needs to be told because right now around the planet where indigenous women are doing things to try and save the land and save our relationship to the planet and helping us learn how to do that. It's the same kinds of things that drove women into the industrial jobs that we had, our tradeswomen, sisters, women miners, and into all the work that we have been doing, and into making our unions become more of tools for us rather than organizations that try to stop the kind of action that is necessary in today's world to happen. We have so much to learn from each other and so much strength and to get from, as people say, from the kind of love that makes the culture of care so powerful. That plus unions, that's what we need. And we're not starting from scratch. And you people who are raising girls now or boys and want to give them some kind of sense that there might be some hope for this planet after all, you've got lots of great stories to go to and lots of history to learn from. And you're not going to find it in the schools that are being driven away from being able to teach real history now. We're carrying that fight forward. We are. But looking at the people who look like you, whether you're black or white, whether you're young or old, whether you live in a city or you live out in the country, people who look like you have done things that you yourself can do as well. I ended my working life as a teacher of middle school kids in an inner city school. And I could bring to those kids the spirit that I had learned from my sisters and brothers in the coal mines. And I thought that was probably a good example of how critical it is to help our kids get a sense of their strength when they look at one another as allies in a struggle that we're all involved in right now. And I want to thank the Mine Wars Museum for all the work that you do, for the forum that you had last time. That was really wonderful, bringing the story of Alabama to us the way that you did, for giving us a chance to talk here today, and for everything that the museum does to help people get a sense of the potential power that we have to make this a planet on which we all can survive and be creative, and there can be a future that's worth us doing everything we can to make happen. So thank you.
Yes, yes, yes.
Thank y'all. Our work would not be possible if it weren't for people like you, Kipp and Marat and Libby and Jessie. Tonight has been so incredible. It has been. I've had a lot of fun doing it. I learned a lot. Like, I'm walking away feeling educated, energized, inspired. I hope the same is true for folks that are watching. You know, I want to say thank you again. Thanks for spending your time and sharing your stories. We are going to close out the night. I've got a couple announcements for folks, and the first is we want your feedback. We've got lots of great comments in the thread, but we do have a short survey. I promise it's only like 5 minutes or less, and we would love to hear what you liked and who you'd like to hear from in the future. I mean, this is a program we're going to keep doing. We want to bring on voices, new voices, and continue to teach truth. Tonight marks the halfway point for season 3 of Mind Wars Forum. We've got 3 episodes left. On upcoming episodes, we're going to talk about nurses at Blair Mountain and healthcare and how that was organized. We're going to talk about the critical but also largely overlooked story of what happened after the Battle of Blair Mountain, which was the miners' treason trials, and the 100-year anniversary is coming up in just a month or two. So please plan to join us for these final episodes, and you can follow along on our social media or sign up for our e-newsletter to make sure you get updates. We've got a few more announcements. The museum is excited to reopen this month for the season. So we're going to be reopening on March 31st, and we're actually expanding our hours this year. So we'll be open throughout November on Thursdays through Saturdays, 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. We're also available for special tours. If you can't come on those days, reach out and we'll work with you the best we can. It's been really exciting this past month. We've been able to have student groups finally come back to the museum. We've welcomed 3 universities just this past month of students that are coming, not just from Appalachia, but St. Louis and places that are farther away. So we'd love to continue doing that work. The second invitation is to get involved. We've got so many community-based projects that are happening right now and that are ongoing. We're building monuments to the miners who marched 100 years ago in Clothier and in Marmet. So we've got community meetings. Those are posted up on our social media. We are visualizing the future of Sid Hatfield's former apartment space and so much more. So if you want to volunteer and get involved, please reach out to us. And then the final invitation is to support the work that the museum does by becoming a sustaining member. I think as it was evidenced tonight, this history isn't just about, learning about something that happened in the past, but it's also about inspiring future generations. And there are perks that come with a museum membership, which Kipp just held up. You get your one-of-a-kind Mind Wars Museum membership card. You also get free admission into the museum. You get a subscription to our biannual journal. So we'll drop a link now for you to join if you're able and interested. And as always, thank you to the guests who spent time with us tonight. I think this was like our most watched episode to date, which is really awesome. Thanks for hanging out and hanging in with us. Thank you to our museum members who support every inch of the work that we do. Thank you to my colleague, Kirsten, who is making magic behind the scenes and supporting us in tech always. And we will see you next time on April 29th. Good night, everybody.
Good night.